episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor. Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show with another really fascinating guest today, helping to create a better tomorrow on many different fronts. Today we are, as I like to refer to, we are going to continue on our virtual road trip around the world, and we are going to be today stopping by Nairobi, Kenya, and visiting with Dr. Vicki Fishlock, who is resident scientist at the Amboseli Trust for Elephants, which is an organization that aims to ensure the long-term conservation and welfare of Africa's elephants in the context of human needs and pressures through various forms of scientific research, training, outreach, and ultimately public awareness and advocacy. And they are actually involved, and we'll get into this a little bit, one of the longest running studies of wild elephants in the world. Dr. Fishlock joined the Amboseli Trust back in January 2011 to study social disruption and recovery in elephant families after a terrible drought that occurred a few years before that. And her work focuses on leadership and negotiation in the face of risk, as well as some of these very long-term social dynamics that we'll learn about in elephant families. Prior to working in Kenya, Dr. Fishlock studied Western gorillas and forest elephants in the Republic of Congo, where she earned her Ph.D. under the supervision of Professor Phyllis Lee, examining these forest clearings as social arenas for elephants. She previously graduated the first class degree in zoology, honors from the University of Edinburgh. After graduation, she worked as a research assistant at Chester Zoo on behavioral and hormonal indicators of welfare in captive orangutans. She's an honorary research fellow, also at the University of Exeter. Dr. Vicki Fishlock, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the show today and talk to us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, it's this is a set of really exciting themes that I've been looking to get into with you. I'd love to start off as we typically do, though, with you, Vicki. Just take a few minutes, if you would, to sort of further introduce yourself. You can sort of take us back a little bit to sort of the beginning, everything from where you grew up, how you got interested in zoology, and a little bit of your early sort of research interest. I think that'll be great for laying the ground for everything else we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, well, I suppose I, like many people, grew up watching wildlife films and just fell in love from being a very small child. And so that was always something that drew me, always a passion that I had. And I was lucky. So I grew up moving around in the UK. My father was in the Navy, but I had some great schooling in the government school system there. And so I figured out that was actually okay at science, which helps. And so, yeah, my love of biology just grew. It was always my favorite subject. And I've just been incredibly fortunate. I mean, I was the first person in my family to go to university, let alone go on and get a doctorate. So I've really been extremely lucky in meeting people who've just helped me open the next door and have the next opportunity. So when I graduated from Edinburgh University, with my undergrad, I basically said to my lecturers, I'll go anywhere and I'll do anything. I just need to get some field experience, because you only learn so much from books, and certainly you need to be in the field to experience all of those challenges and get that practical experience. And one of my lecturers wrote to me and said, there's the Netherlands Doki Park has a study called the Bailey Guy study, and she sent me an email that I thought was basically just a job advert. And so I opened up the email, and she said, oh, if you want to do it, they want to hear from you, because I've already given you a recommendation. And 6 weeks later, I got on a plane to Congo, and that kind of just set everything going and never really looked back. So I was so lucky though. I mean, that study had been going for about 10 years by the time I joined. And I was still one of the people who watched the first observation of wild tool use in gorillas. So that was just incredible. And then from there, I got really interested in the forest elephants, which at that point we knew relatively little about. And so there was quite a good data set there that I kind of got looking at and cleaning up. And from there, sort of developed my PhD questions. And fortunately for me, Phyllis had just moved from her Cambridge position, where she was in bioanthropology, up to Stirling, where she could actually take on a student like me who's interested in these kind of social dynamic questions. So again, another lucky break. And then so I went back to Congo to do my PhD fieldwork in a place called Odzala, which is 15,500 square kilometers of protected area. And at that time, there was no kind of support system. And now it's been taken on by Africa Parks, but there's no protection, there's no money. So it was just me and a group of guys in the middle of the forest. And yeah, when I look back now, I think that's kind of crazy. But yeah, I had a wonderful time. And then again, fortuitously, I went to a conference in 2009 and met Cynthia through Phyllis. They'd obviously been working together for a long time by that point. And Cynthia and I just had a great time. The conference was in France, so we sat in the sun drinking wine and talking about elephants, and I guess that was my job interview. So I was chatting to them about a study which we're actually working on now about young male independence. And so I sort of, when I finished up my PhD later in 2010, I wrote to Cynthia and I said, look, I would love to come out to Kenya and talk more about that project and how we might get it funded. And I actually got an email back from Phyllis, and she said, we can't prioritize the males right now. The females are more important because of this big drought that they just had. So they'd got some money. So she said, would you mind working on the girls? And I went, sure. So again, 6 weeks later, literally 6 weeks later, got on a plane, moved out here. Yeah, and I've been here 10 years. I met my husband out here, had a baby last year. So yeah, definitely entrenched now.
Lovely. I appreciate that that background, Vicki. And it's some of the things that you mentioned, and obviously we'll go into some of the sort of the subsets of these different research projects you've been involved in. But I'd love if you could, from the perspective of the core program that's been going on at Amboseli for I believe since the mid 1970s, and once again, you mentioned the African forest elephant. I did a little, obviously Googling here, and wow, these species live 60 to 70 years. So unlike a lot of the species that we talk about on the show, and some other rats and mice and so forth, this is a bit of a longer project. When you study birth, when you study mating, death, this is not short-term stuff. Talk a little bit, if you would, about just the core research of Amboseli and how that sort of what the genesis of all of that was, and then a little later on we'll get into your specific some of the specific things you've written about.
So I suppose the first thing to say is that elephants are not a model study system from a scientific point of view. And things take a really long time to happen. And I think, so Cynthia started the study in September 1972. And I think at that point she was expecting to be around there for about 3 to 5 years, and realized a couple of years in that that was not going to kind of work. What makes the Amboseli study so special is not only that it is the longest running study of elephants in the world. So we have been tracking these on an individual basis since 1972. It's that individual perspective. And I think that's probably also the most important thing that's come out of our work and come through the project, through the films, the books that Cynthia's done, and through our science as well, is that elephants are individuals. And so pretty much anything that you ask me, I'll say, well, it depends. It depends who, and it depends when. And both of those things are really important. So I think that's why one of the other questions we get asked is, well, you've been doing this for 50 years, surely there's nothing else to find out. We are only now being able to get the sample sizes, large enough sample sizes, have enough animals go through their whole life trajectory to be able to answer some of the questions that we're really interested in. Similarly, the computing techniques to answer these complex questions and be able to layer individual trajectories against all these factors that you're interested in, those techniques are really only coming to fruition now. And I'm thinking about things like social networks, those analytical techniques that really let you get at these questions and pick apart the trends while allowing everybody to vary as they do. So, it's everything. It just is so different. A young male who is going independent from his family could leave at the age of 8. He could leave at the age of 18. He could go independent instantly, sort of just up and leave. He could spend several years bouncing between several families or coming back to his family for a couple of months at a time and going off again. So, you know, that's just one example of the amount of variation that we're looking at. So I think that's what makes this study so special, is because we treat the elephants as individuals. They're individual data points, but we also get to know them and appreciate them as individuals as well. So we've done, some of our research has been things like the multi-dimensional personality scoring that's really accepted in the primate field, or even for domestic animals. We've applied those to elephants to say that, firstly, observers are reliable within their observations in different time points, but also different observers see the same thing. And so we really feel now we can get firstly, that we understand that elephants, we understand their body language and behavior, which in and of itself is remarkable, given that about 80% of what they communicate to each other vocally is below the range of human hearing. So you only hear about the top 20% of what elephants are saying to each other. And so we live in a really different sensory world to them. And so as a behavioral scientist, that presents some challenges. Luckily, elephants are also really good with their body cues.
Sure.
And so you can infer a huge amount. But yeah, so I think our study really understanding individuals in their individual contexts. So I can look at a male joining a family, and sometimes I can tell from his behavior that he belongs to that family, even it was at the stage before I knew everybody. But I can go and because of the richness of the project, I can look at those interactions and go, that's his babysitter from when he was a kid. That's his auntie, that's his mum. You know, even these males who are 20, 30, 40 years old, you see them interacting with their mothers or their grandmothers. And that's just amazing. So I think understanding elephants in that rich way has enabled us to be much better advocates for what they need. And that's really important as these landscapes are transformed and changed,
Sure.
Which is something I'm sure we'll get into later. But we also have that very long data set, so we can say, well, this is how things used to be. And that's the great thing about elephants, they're really flexible. So the study that I joined to do, which was looking at how elephant families cope after this terrible drought, the reason we're interested in that is that we know from other places that poaching, particularly, or culling operations can have devastating consequences on elephant social structure. And those are intergenerational effects. It's mediated by stress hormones. It basically manifests itself as PTSD. So individuals have really high chronic hormone levels, really elevated cortisol. Those have long-term effects on their immune function, their reproductive function, and their physical and social well-being. So they tend to be really triggered, can be very aggressive or very flighty. And so we've seen that fall apart in several places across Africa. And it was really important to understand whether that is going to happen anyway, as droughts may become more frequent in some areas. Then you have these mortality pulses that get set up. And the most vulnerable are those under 2 and older animals, especially old females. And that means that there can be very high turnover in leadership within a family or within a population. And we wanted to understand, how bad is that for elephants? The good news is that it actually doesn't look like it's that bad if all else is equal. And that's probably because the amount of psychosocial stress that animals are going through, it may be high, but if they're also struggling to survive and they're sort of in semi-starvation mode, then they're probably, their memory of that, when the good times come back again, their recovery is probably easier because they're in sort of some kind of fog. I certainly experienced that when I lost my father a couple of years ago.
Sure.
You are, as a grieving person, you go through some degree of like mental fuzziness, and then subsequently it's quite hard to recall other like events that had happened immediately following. I suspect it's quite similar for elephants. If you're going through a tough time, then that kind of mental shutdown, they have very similar brain structure to humans. So they have a high number of mirror neurons. They have a lot of prefrontal cortex. There's a lot of structure that's associated with memory and relationships. So I think it's fair to draw those comparisons without being accused of being anthropomorphic.
Sure.
So the great thing is that elephants can recover from major stresses. And the thing that probably makes that possible is having an intact age structure. So you have, even if you've lost your 60 and 70-year-old females, you've got 40-year-old females who are really experienced, who can step up and kind of buffer everybody and being those new social centers. And then not having a lot of extra pressures and stress. So the Amboseli elephants are really, really probably the luckiest elephants in Africa. They live in a place where food resources are pretty much evenly distributed. They don't have a lot of anthropogenic pressure, or haven't up to now. That is changing. And so it makes them a really good system, because we can look at them and say, okay, this is pretty much what elephants do when people more or less leave them alone. And we can understand what their potential is to be able to cope with change, because elephants really are stakeholders in these environments. So it's not like you can't just put in a conservation strategy and say, that's it, we're done, and you can go home. These are dynamic systems, and they have multiple stakeholders with different interest groups within that. And I'm talking in both in human and non-human groups. And then elephants particularly, they don't just act, they react to strategies. So you put up a fence, they learn to break fences. You put up, you throw firecrackers, they learn that that's okay, that's actually not a risk. They have this massive capacity for learning and massive capacity to be flexible, which is probably why they can occupy such a diverse range of habitats. But I feel like that is something that we should be tapping to ensure coexistence between elephants and people, because it's really important for the habitats that they have such huge impacts for the habitats that they live in. Yep. So I don't think that everybody has to like elephants, but they really have massive impacts. They are ecosystem engineers, and for these ecosystems to stay functioning and healthy and able to react and adapt to the climate changes that may be coming their way or other changes, it's really important that that resilience is built in. And I see elephants as a key part of that, and a key part of these landscapes. And a really good example of that is colleagues of ours in Amboseli had been monitoring livelihoods for pastoralists in the area. Okay. And they've been doing a lot of ecological monitoring as well. And they show that in areas where elephants stop going, then the pasture is less good for livestock. Mm-hmm. So actually, there's actually about a 30% decline in pasture quality if you take elephants out of the equation, sure, or if you're a pastoralist. So it's why these livelihoods can be so compatible with conservation and wildlife. But it just means that we need to kind of get a handle on what everybody needs in this system and build solutions that everyone can kind of live with.
Outstanding. That's a fascinating array of themes. We're going to delve down into some of it now. Sorry. But I just want to interject one thing. I don't want to know anybody that doesn't like. Who doesn't like elephants? I mean, come on.
Well, so I think if you get to enjoy elephants the way that I do, then you like them. And I haven't ever taken anyone out with elephants who hasn't been profoundly moved and connected by that experience. Like, everybody is just, even people who've said to me previously, I didn't think I was that bothered, but that was the most amazing thing. That was the most incredible experience. Absolutely. But the flip side is that's one group of people. There are other people who are trying to make a livelihood, who are trying to get their kids to school, or trying to access healthcare services, or trying to eke out a living as farmers. Yeah. And elephants are not good neighbors for everybody. So one of the things that we're trying to do in our ecosystem is figure out where compatible activities can happen and where they can't. And where they can't, like where that is a hard edge for elephants and other species. It's not just elephants, but of course they're incredibly visible, they're incredibly important, they're incredibly valuable as tourism generators, and they just, they're the icon in a lot of ways. Where those things are not compatible, we have to decide where those edges need to be, and what and how we can reinforce them to keep both people and elephants safe. That's the goal.
Absolutely. Vicki, let's start off. You've published quite a bit over the years, and I'd love to start off with this 2016 paper from the journal Behavioral Ecology and Social Biology. It's entitled The Reproductive Advantage of a Long Life, Longevity and Senescence in Wild Female African Elephants. And it's interesting, several episodes ago, we actually talked about elephants on the show from this perspective of this pedos paradox, where you have this strange non-correlation between size of an organism and rates of cancer, elephants, whales, organisms of this nature. And a lot of that focused, it was a cancer-centric show, focusing on sort of this abundance of tumor suppression that elephants have. Very interesting. In this particular paper, you go into longevity for some different angles here. You talk about that elephants have this significant post-fertile phase of survival, unlike smaller organisms. And, you studied not just how sort of that fertility changed over time, but some of these very interesting sort of, and I'm telling you, the social biology about how children, mothers, and grandparents in these families, all work together. Sort of what I sort of think of this social determinants that we talk a lot about in terms of health, longevity in humans. Talk a little bit about some of the things that you learned in this particular paper, specifically focusing on this theme.
Yeah, so this is one of the papers that has taken us a really long time to produce, because we have, your data set is both left and right censored. Yep. So left censored is everybody who was alive at the start of the study. You don't know what happened before you started observing them. Yep. And then right censored is everybody who's still alive hasn't finished their life trajectory right yet. So if you look at the paper, some of these sample size looks startlingly small, but if you've got an animal who can live 60, 70, 75 years, then waiting for them to kind of finish their life history. Not that we wait around for that, but it's difficult to get the sample sizes that you need. So it did take us a really long time. I think the most exciting thing about this paper is that although there is a post-fertile survival period, it is not the classic that everyone assumed was going to happen. So basically, for highly social species where your survival as a youngster depends on your social network, not just your parents, but an extended caregiving network and the experience that gives. So things like species like chimps and humans and whales. There's these strong grandmother effects, and having a grandmother around changes a lot for how well you do and how well your mum does raising you, and so how quickly she has more offspring. What's neat is that although elephants slow down, they don't stop completely. And the idea behind this post-fertile survival is that at some point it pays you more to invest your experience into looking after the kids you've already got and their grandkids and seeing and then doing well than it does for you to keep producing offspring. And certainly in killer whales, which have some very strong similarities with elephants and some very interesting differences as well. That's what killer whale females do, and these very long post-fertile survivorship really increases the reproductive success of offspring, particularly sons for whales. Elephants don't really do that. So they slow down, but they don't really stop. And so a female in her 60s can still have a healthy calf, and that calf, its only risk factor is mum dying. And that's true for all calves. I mean, your biggest risk factor is basically if you lose your mum before you're 2, that's sort of game over. And even if you lose your mum before you're 9, there are extended effects on your survival and well-being. So I think it's fascinating that elephants are still cranking kids out when they're 60 odd. And it's pretty neat when you think not only are they building these huge bodies out of plants, they're creating babies and maintaining milk, and they're pretty much pregnant and lactating from the time they start, unless there's a big drought and everybody's had to cease reproduction. That can be sort of, female can have her first kid when she's about 13 all the way through till she's 50 or beyond, which is incredible. So it's sort of what you were saying about they are at the extreme end. So understanding their idiosyncrasies and life history patterns. It is really informative. Although the early reviewers of the paper did not agree with that.
It was as we're reading, it was interesting when you're pointing out that a mother and grandmother can be having children together alongside each other. And once again, it got me thinking of another theme that we've gotten into on previous shows, so this intergenerational component, how the elderly have so much to teach the youth and vice versa, and we're just learning the sort of the importance of this in human health and wellness. That it was intriguing to see it pop up in this a version of it in this paper. So
yeah, and age and experience are hugely important for elephants, for males and females, all the way. So these animals are learning all the way through their lives, and sometimes adapting, sometimes not. But all elephants are really attracted to older individuals, especially older males. And that's a really strong influence for them. And it's probably how the kind of elephants can learn from each other. We know that they can learn a huge amount from each other, and they learn in lots of different ways. But the thing about elephant families, just pulling it back to a family context, is that these friendships that families have between them, they also persist after matriarchs die. So they are intergenerational effects of your early social relationships. And we've seen some friendships between families persist for decades, which is also remarkable. And a family itself, it's not really just a genetic unit. It is, I think of it as a group of females who have similar social and ecological strategies, because actually if they don't, then somebody will leave and then eventually form a new family. So you kind of, all of this is happening in the context of a fission fusion society where not everyone is together all of the time. So yeah, it's really, from an analysis point of view, it gets mind-bending fairly quickly, but it is utterly fascinating to see these lives pan out. It's really, really cool.
Continuing along that set of themes and sort of this, not just what they learn, but this ability of others to teach in the group. Another one of your papers entitled "Elephant Resource Use Traditions." This was in Animal Cognition Journal, 2016, and you go into, once again, these really unique habitats that elephants learn to extract certain resources from. I think the one sort of off the top of my head that I somewhat know of from a previous life, but sort of certain clays that they might like to eat to make them for sort of zoopharmacognosy type things. Talk a little bit about not just sort of some of the resource access and sort of some of the things they've learned, but some of the sort of once again this teaching component about how sort of there is this social, I think you talk about ecological knowledge that is transferred through these different generations in the family.
Yeah, so this more, this paper was about the forest elephants, and it actually came out from one of the kind of, oh no, it hasn't worked moments from my PhD. So the Central African rainforests are on some of the oldest soils in the world. So you have this massive, diverse plant habitat with just incredible trees and plants and this richness where everywhere you look, there's bugs and lichen, and just it's crazy alive. But it's on really, really old soils, and they're really depleted. And that means that everything's pretty salt limited. So in the forest, if you put down a dish of sugar and a dish of salt, you'd have ants and bees and insects all heading for the salt, pretty much ignoring the sugar, because that's their limiting resource.
Sure.
And so the supposition has always been that these forest clearings, these byes, are created and maintained by elephant activity, and they go and they do a very particular sequence of behaviors. Every single one, there's hundreds of thousands of clearings across the Central African rainforest, and when you see elephants in these clearings, they do the same thing. They go to these kind of sinkholes, they plunge their trunks through this upper matrix, and then they start pumping out this water. And everyone was kind of like, well, it's mineral rich, it will be mineral rich water. the trouble is that every sampling regime that went through, kind of where you have, you sample from where the elephants are taking, and then you sample from some control site nearby. Nobody was finding any statistical differences, and I did the same during my PhD. I was looking at taking soil samples from within and then from within the forest, and seeing no differences. And it's very similar to the elephants here in Mount Elgon and the north of Kenya, where these elephants have actually dug a cave system into the side of Mount Elgon, and they learned to go through. There's wonderful footage that Attenborough narrated a few years ago, where they put in an infrared camera and one elephant bumped its head, kind of going through, because he didn't realize that it was a lower point in the ceiling. So elephants do these like pretty extreme things and pretty weird things, but we can't detect what it is that they're accessing. And so in this paper, I'd argue that maybe the reason that you go to do this here is because everybody else goes to do it there. And so it's not that you couldn't get those resources from these other places, but you learn to do it from a very young age because your mum's done it. And then actually there are other benefits to going to clearing. So you get, especially for forest elephants who live in much smaller groups, whose family relationships are much more diffuse. So it doesn't mean that they don't know who their sister or their niece is. They don't spend time together in these big multi-family groups or multi-generational groups like the savanna elephants do. And that's probably because the fruit resources, which they really depend on, are really distributed in space and time. And so it's just not possible to be in a big group. And elephants do like to be together. They do it wherever you find them. You find them aggregating at some point in the year where ecological conditions permit. So I think that clearings really, they permit these aggregations. And so, yeah, you get some physical resource there, but actually the best thing is the social resources that you get there. And that's contact with competitors, contact with friends, just learning about what everybody else is doing. Where, if you kind of imagine one of these clearings, so an elephant comes in and they suddenly do a nice big fresh dung pile, right. You can sample that and see what fruits might be available, and then kind of maybe remember where they are, or just follow their scent from where they came from and kind of figure stuff out. So these trail systems that connect these clearings are amazing big parts. I mean, you could literally drive a double-decker bus through, and it is all from elephant traffic. They will close up now in all these areas where forest elephants have been decimated by poaching, but the time when I was there, some of these trails are still open, and it's remarkable. And those trails connect important landscape features. They connect important fruit trees, and they connect clearings. So if you're lost in the forest and you need to find a clearing, then you walk along an elephant path, and sooner or later it will bring you to a clearing. They're amazing. So this is another way that elephants are landscape architects in these habitats that they have. So yeah, going back to what happens in a clearing, I think a lot of what happens is you go there because you can hang out with others and you can learn, and there's a huge amount of extra information that you can tap into if you access with others. And what we see is that even when poaching has been high around clearings, elephants continue to come in, even though they might be really scared. And I think that shows also that there's this driver for them to be together and to aggregate.
Really fascinating. And yeah, while it's a tough topic, and you mentioned poaching a few times, but you do have this paper in Conservation Biology, the consequences of poaching and anthropogenic change for forest elephants. And here you talk about there's been a lot of study on this in terms of the savanna elephants. Here you're talking about the Central African forest elephants, but about a year ago, I had the chance to speak to Dr. Thomas Hildebrandt up in Leibniz, and his focus was the northern white rhino, and one of the areas that he was very, he spoke about dung, but you think of this resource that ultimately, is a food for worms and then dragonflies and potentially bats. And there's a whole chain that occurs from these megafauna. And when you disrupt them, elephants, you're finding the same thing. And you mentioned some of this, not just in sort of the macro level, but you're talking about some of this sort of this epigenetic stress and how that can be passed on for generations. Once again, I know this is a tough topic, but walk us through a little bit of how do you study poaching? Like, I mean, this must be horrible as you're studying. They're not poaching in the Amboseli community, correct?
No, we've been extremely lucky, and so I would say I'm not an expert on poaching for elephants for that reason, which has been amazing. The study population that I was looking at for my PhD experienced quite a big poaching surge after I'd left, which is now thankfully sort of under control. It's just been a huge problem across much of elephant range, and it's a massively publicized problem. But I would also say that elephants are actually more threatened in some ways by habitat conversion and habitat loss. So huge changes in land tenure, land use, the areas that, in fact, the news this week, there's been this story about these elephants in China walking hundreds of kilometers, probably because there's nothing left for them. They're kind of looking for a safe space. And that brings me to something that I feel is not talked about enough, which is that elephant range is not static. Right, we think about this so they were well distributed across the continent at some time point X, but where you find elephants at any given time point is really a function of what else is going on in the landscape. So if you looked at Amboseli in the 1890s, it emptied of people and wildlife because of rinderpest. And so in Amboseli, what we kind of saw was almost a recolonization event from a few survivors and then moving in. And I think it's really, it's not something that anyone has studied formally yet. And I'm really interested in this question because I think that helps us plan for how we divide up the space that we have. And, you're talking about having compatible areas. And so it might be that elephants are not in a space that you would quite like them to be. And then how do you encourage that? So you're moving them away from an urban center and encouraging them to somewhere where there's the habitat to support them, and they're not going to come into struggles with coexisting with people. And there are really great stories about the clearing of the landmines in Angola, northern Angola after the year war. And so what you see first is young males, and then a few years later you see big males, and then a few years after that you see females in these areas where habitat becomes safe, and that has been repeated from every waterhole or new lodge kind of conservancy that I've seen. So I think that we need to think, if we want elephants to be part of the future, we need to think about what we realistically have to offer at the moment, how that's going to change, and then how we can use our knowledge of elephant behavior and biology to keep them safe in those areas and to manage the interface between people and elephants. And that's really, I think, what we need to talk about. And poaching is sort of one component of that, right? So poaching is a really complicated issue. It's driven by an elite. It's driven by a luxury market, but it's mediated by poverty and corruption in range state countries. And so those are massive social problems to tackle. But those poverty and corruption drivers also facilitate huge other problems for wildlife generally and ecosystems, and therefore the people that live in them. So everybody needs to care about clean air and clean water. So for me, I feel like poaching is a really great way to introduce people to more complex topics, and it can have really great front page headline grabbing narratives. But the stories are so much more complex. It goes so much further beyond poaching. And so you can't just solve a poaching issue or solve an illegal trade issue and expect everything else to be okay.
Sure. Vicki, what are some of the technologies? I mean, I was reading on the Amboseli site, a little further down the list, there was, some genetic work that you're doing, obviously the whole animal cognition side. When it comes to sort of doing some of this monitoring, and obviously after last year we had, are you involved with drones, artificial intelligence? What are some of the tools that you bring to bear, the things that you would like to see looking forward to tap into, aside from just obviously Vicki Fishlock hanging out in the rainforest watching stuff? What are some of the things that useful
so actually on the Amboseli project, I have to say we're pretty old school, because once you've set up, and also once you've set up data collection protocols a certain way, you have to kind of maintain them, and so and also working in Central Africa in my early career, every piece of electronic equipment that could fail would fail. So, I'm still a pencil and a piece of paper kind of girl, But in terms of what technology can do to help our understanding of elephants and our conservation, there's so much. So the genetic work that we did was with collaborators, was fascinating, but we have a way more to go. But it's also having, lab facilities in Kenya and students in Kenya that we can work with, and those are all coming online, but a number of projects have been delayed because of COVID. So we have collaborators who we're desperate to kind of get stuck in and get funding for some students and get some questions answered, but yeah, for the moment that's some of that has been put on a pause. I think the early drones were so loud that they were really a deterrent factor. I've seen amazing footage. One of an MSc student that I helped supervise down in South Africa worked in Majeti and Rwanda National Parks, where they've done huge translocation operations, and one of the things that he was doing was setting up a drone protocol. So like, how do you use a drone responsibly so that you're not actually terrifying animals and not actually changing, so you can actually observe the things that you might be interested in. But also here in Kenya, drones have been, the legal status of drones was really unclear for a long time. So it was really difficult to get a license. That's now been resolved. And a lot of people are starting to use them as deterrents for keeping elephants out of farmland or other areas that you don't want them to be. And the reason to do that is that, if you put a drone up, firstly, it's really difficult for elephants to habituate to a drone because they're really annoying. Like, they don't like things above them. And so, but also you're not putting people in any line of fire. So elephants are not learning that people are dangerous or annoying or intimidating or need to be threatened from that point of view. So I think in terms of using them as a behavioral management tool, I think that could be amazing. Also, from a data collection from science and monitoring point of view, getting samples out in places where it's really hard to put people, or whether you have to be on foot and it might be dangerous, that is amazing. And the range, as the range of these drones expands, the possibilities expand as well. Gotcha. So but yeah, we'll still be going out in the Land Rover with a pen and a piece of paper and our data sheets.
Nothing wrong with that, but then thinking about that, whether it's as you say, old school Vicki Fishlock hanging out in the savannah, give me some visions 5 years out, 10 years out. I know these are long projects, but what are some of the things that that are on your list that, hey, I'd like to start this?
We're about to turn 50 next year. So I have been in COVID and post-baby lockdown developing a new digital database that basically houses every piece of information we've collected over 50 years, which means that in terms of sharing data with people who might be interested in mining our data for new analysis, that they are much smarter than I am and know cool maths that I don't, is fantastic. Because for the last few years, we've had some great proposals, and I've sat and looked at it and gone, that's actually 3 weeks work for me to pull that data set together, and I have don't know, proposals or whatever else that occupies time. So in terms of uniting that would be amazing. For our own analysis, I'm really interested in these long-term dynamics between families. And so as that data set is now finally in a computer and cleaned and sort of united with the other parameters that are really important, I am actually going to be working with some whale biologists, so friends of mine who study orcas, who have a very similar study system with a very similar sort of length of project, and kind of just explaining what a family can look like. And they have some really cool new ways of modeling how families might change over time, how relationships can change over time. So I'm really excited about getting into some of this, because these are things that are really interesting, and we can tell anecdotes about, and I'm pretty sure, like, my instinct is that it's there in the data, but we haven't done the analysis for yet. And at the same time, we also have a study going on into young males' independence and then leaving their families, because it's something that nobody has understood very much about. It's something that we can see that there's huge variability in. And I feel like it's a really important part of this human wildlife interface, because these are the young risk takers who are going to come up hard against new land use or different areas. And so I think, firstly, keeping them safe is important, but also understanding how they're likely to behave and how that will have a knock-on for the ranging and behavior of the rest of your population is really important. So those are my two big pushes at the moment. And then, I think as we come through to 5 decades of data, we need to also go back and look at some of the early work, some of the early analysis, and look at whether the ecosystem changes that we have experienced have really kind of changed things for those analysis. So in the early years of the study, the elephant's population was really small, and it was really compressed, or really stayed very close to the national park, which is the center of the ecosystem. Through great conservation efforts by a number of excellent organizations and Kenya Wildlife Service, that has changed, and elephants who used to spend 6 months in the park, now we see them once or twice a year. And they're doing great in the areas that they are, and these families have become large and successful. So it's really important. We have an MSc student starting looking at feeding ecology, because the feeding ecology work that was done at the beginning, in the early years of the project, was massively valuable, but in that time a lot has changed. And so we want to understand how both ranging changes and habitat changes might be influencing what elephants are eating, and how well they're doing. So we have a lot of data mining to do, a lot of cleaning up and analysis. So there's still a lot of work to do. And of course, now we have such a valuable study. I mean, it's just every year it gets more valuable to keep following these individuals and understand more about their lives. We hope for new collaborators to join us and talk to us about ideas we haven't even thought of yet.
I'm sure there's quite a few that will keep you busy for a while. I see how this can go in many different directions, and really fascinating. Vicki, take some time, if you would, to mention, shout out to any sort of the mentors. I just mentioned your Ph.D. advisor previously. Other people involved, not just in this, but some of the other programs you've been involved in, really have kept Dr. Vicki Fishlock focused and interested in staying the course in this particular area. Take your time, mention anyone you want.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so there are many. So the first people are the people who I work with here in Kenya. So Noranjirani and Katita Sayalel, who have been working on the Amboseli project since 1985 and 1992, respectively, who taught me the elephants when I joined, who have helped me as I've built this database, helped me figure out where everything belongs. And then Cynthia, of course, because without Cynthia Moss, this project wouldn't have existed. And just to keep this kind of study running for 49 years is just an extraordinary achievement. I mean, to keep the funding going, replace the car when a tree fell on her Land Rover. And even in this past year, just keeping us going. And that has been thanks to all the amazing donors and supporters who have helped us keep going through this time. We couldn't have done it without them. And then, my colleagues at Exeter, my PhD office mate, Kim Hawkins, who's at Exeter, who just keep, just talking to people who work on really different systems, but keep that love of data and questions and science alive. Those are things that when you've had long meetings or long policy discussions, then you're going to try and get your data, trying to get your knowledge within some kind of framework that's going to help protect the place that you're working. That takes a huge amount of time, takes a huge amount of effort, but then you come back to an email from someone going, oh, I saw this really cool paper and I thought you'd like this, and why don't we try and do this graph? Those are things that keep me going. And there are far too many people to mention, but they know who they are, and I really am so grateful, and I keep meeting new people. That's the other wonderful thing about my job. So the MSc student Wes, who I supervise, I learned so much from him about very, very different environment and very different kind of sets of conditions. And it's just amazing that what's so great about my job is that you can continue to be surprised in a good way. And there's never an end point, right? There's always something new to think about and learn. We have some great collaborators here in Kenya Wildlife Service and in Save the Elephants, and they've been great in helping us expand our thinking about where we should be heading. And it's exciting, which is nice, because ahead of all the doom and gloom, it's nice to feel that spark come into your work so often, and it's always through the people that we work with.
Last but by no means least, of course, is someone I've already thanked and mentioned, is Professor Phyllis Lee, who was my PhD supervisor, so guided me through that process. But as Director of Science for ATE, has been a friend, colleague, collaborator, fellow elephant lover, who also just loves data as well. So she's the person who really has helped me kind of fulfill everything that I wanted to achieve when I was an undergrad. So she is my biggest mentor, person who I owe the most thanks to.
If I could give you just a couple more minutes, there was one question I wanted to ask you about. I know this is a little out of order, but I'll just go back to it and finish up with this one. But you had me thinking about just elephant health in general, and I wanted to know, actually, as I'm thinking about all this data and everything you're observing, obviously elephants get sick along the way. We talked about some of these different conditions that most of us don't think about with folks like at the Smithsonian. When elephants naturally get sick, when you're doing your research, how does that impact? I mean, obviously, are you involved at all, as with your background in zoology, in treating elephants ever, or is it sort of one of those things like, let's just observe this as a part of our phenomena that we're researching? I don't know much about what elephants get sick with, but
we don't know much about what elephants get sick from, to be honest, apart from leaving aside the things that humans do that make them ill or unwell or injured. We know relatively little about it. So we know anthrax can kill elephants, and it does in certain places. We also know that anthrax is a background present in pretty much all the ecosystems that elephants live in. So it's really fascinating question. So the 2009 drought that I joined the study to look at how everybody recovered from that. In Amboseli, there's always permanent fresh water. There's 2 large swamps that are fed from springs from Kilimanjaro. So it's not a lack of water that kills elephants in Amboseli. It's a lack of primary productivity. So basically, there's just nothing good for them to eat. But a lot of the elephants who died during that drought, they weren't actually starving. I mean, starving elephants are really like skin and bones, it's just, and so, and it may be that they were succumbing to parasite loads or other illnesses. There is one disease that we know the elephants suffer from, that cows also suffer, and they look dreadful while it happens. So they manifest, they kind of walk in a very stiff fashion, and they look like their joints hurt. You can tell that they're in pain, and they look absolutely dreadful, and then they recover from it at some point, and it looks like it's probably driven by something they're consuming, because it breaks out in certain, so if you see one elephant with this disease, it's more likely you're going to see somebody else with it in the next coming weeks. But we have no idea about what that is. So, I mean, we'd love to work more. Kenya Wildlife Service has been really stretched in their vet department. So we've only had a resident vet within Amboseli within the last couple of years, and they're funded by the Sheldrick Wildlife Trust, which has been amazing. But their job has really been largely dealing with, kind of the emergencies. So a giraffe with a bad leg, or an elephant who's limping, kind of those kind of things. And so the research arm of that has huge potential. So one of the things that I've been talking with a number of colleagues about as I've developed this database is a systematic way of logging illness symptoms, because, we don't know when heaven forbid, a new outbreak of something would happen. But we need to make sure that we're tracking it, and we can give as accurate information as we can to veterinary experts here in Kenya and elsewhere. So yeah, I'm not a vet, so we would call a vet if we thought that an animal needed examining, but also you have to remember that to examine a wild elephant, you have to immobilize them, and actually sometimes that like any anesthesia carries its own risks, and so sometimes the best thing is to just watch and see what happens. We try not to intervene unless it is human mediated, because we feel like, largely it is human mediated. A lot of what the elephants experience with us is, and that, like I say, they're really lucky compared to other elephant populations where, colleagues of mine see elephants with gunshot wounds frequently, and either because they live in a conflict area or because of attempted poaching. Those things usually are correlated with each other. So yeah, like our elephants are incredibly lucky, but still we have stuff happening to them, and we're lucky that we have a vet who we can call.
Got it.
But it's not something that we have a massive, and I kind of hope we don't need to have a massive study push for it, because it'd be great if they stay healthy. But yeah, we're building the capacity so that if something were to start happening that worried us, that we would be able to respond and kind of share information and bring in experts to help. But yeah, it's a mystery. We don't know very much at all about what kills them, and not least because actually physically conducting a post-mortem on an elephant is no mean feat, right? It's either in terms of time, effort, or manpower. So yeah, we hope to see more of that research happening across, for all populations, because it's really important. But yeah, we need to start thinking about what resources may be missing.
Right. Yeah. It got me thinking, because we talked a bit in the past about this, the lowland gorillas and this fibrotic heart disease that they were having in zoos here in the United States, and it sort of connected to this crop that they would normally eat in West Africa, and so it got me thinking some of the sort of the zoo. I know this is not our zoo pharmacognosy, and some of the learnings that obviously this is a whole other data set, but not giving you extra projects to do, but there could be interesting
no, it's just exciting, right? Like at 3 a.m, I can think about these things. Yeah, and I think that's also a really important point, that like the camera, so elephants in captivity really don't do very well, and their life expectancies are really compromised, and so they kind of, everyone wants to know what's an average age for an elephant, and that's really unhelpful when you have such a massive spread of risk. And it's I find it's most helpful to think about it like a human, kind of without modern medicine, right? So think about when you're most vulnerable, under the age of 2, before you're weaned, and then when you start doing adult activities, especially as a male, and you kind of start learning to use tools and things, you get this mortality pulse, because it's the riskiest time to get injured. And then it kind of like all of your other risk factors sort of settle down until you move into old age, because you use experience to kind of buffer the other dangers. Elephants are sort of similar, and yet even in zoos, their life expectancy can be really short and really compromised. And I think that tells us, so even with veterinary care and no predation and perfect nutrition, kind of like regular food, they're still having massive problems. And so like herpes is a huge problem in captive elephants, especially in Europe at the moment. And nobody really understands why that is. But I think, for me, although I did work in zoo environments in the past, and I think that they can be amazing spaces for conservation, I don't feel that a zoo environment is an appropriate space for an elephant. And I think that the survival data just shows that. We just can't give them what they need. It's sort of similar to killer whales or polar bears. Like when you think about the amount of space and choice and interaction potential these animals are geared and evolved to deal with, it's just not possible to mimic that within a captive setting.
Got it. Really, really fascinating set of programs, Vicki. And I just I want to wish you the best with all of this. I know you'll do great with everything you have planned and all the future projects. For everybody that's going to be listening to this particular episode on our podcast or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Dr. Vicki Fishlock from Nairobi, Kenya, resident scientist, Amboseli Trust for Elephants, aiming to ensure the long-term conservation and welfare of Africa's elephants. Vicki, I just want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us about these very fascinating topics. Thank you for everything you're doing over there for the elephants. And as we say in our show, thank you for helping to create a better tomorrow through these initiatives. Very inspiring.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be able to step back and kind of look at the big picture again and get excited about all this potential and all the places that we want to go and all the great collaborators that we're going to work with to get us there. So yeah, I'm very, very pleased and very happy to have joined you. Thank you so much.
Outstanding.